But first, I'll tell you kind of what we're going to actually talk about, and then I'll get into, who I am and all the fun stuff. So I'll introduce myself at the beginning so that it's not just a nameless, well, I guess, named face talking to you of a stranger. Then we'll talk about what PMing actually is, what it kind of looks like, some stories that I think are entertaining, and some skills that you actually, I think, are really important for when you're an actual product manager. And of course, the fun part that everyone likes to talk about, which is the recruiting process for product management roles. It's very enjoyable. And then I left some time at the end, I hope, for Q&A. And hopefully that sounds good for everyone. If it doesn't, I'm so sorry. The slides are set in stone, so I can't really help you there. Cool. So who am I? That's a great question. Boring stuff. I went to Harvard, just graduated, class of 2020, and I work for Google. And I presume people know both of those. It's very fun. More entertaining things are that I live in San Diego currently, also known as San Diego if you're not a vampire. And a fun fact is that I got a C in calculus. It might have been a C+, so that's kind of cool. I was just very arrogant and didn't go to class. Don't do that. Go to class. It's worth it. Yeah, so that's enough about me. Product management. PMing is kind of a weird term because it can be product or program or project. I'm a product manager. We have program managers, and I think we have project managers. And they all do slightly different things, but there's a lot of intersections between the roles. So, anything I say, mileage may vary. I also should preface this with all of these are my own opinions, not the opinions of my employer and all the fun legal stuff. Anyway, product management is defined by many different people in many different ways. I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of someone who's living these things day to day. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was ambiguity. It's one of the best parts about product management is your parents are like, what do you do? And you're like, I don't know. It's really fun. So ambiguity is kind of a huge part of the role because you're not really told a whole lot. You're often kind of just don't know. Things are happening. I'm not sure why. I don't know how, and I'm going to hopefully not get fired. That sounds like a joke. It's mostly a joke, but sometimes you're very, very concerned. A lot of times people will ask you, or you'll get questions like, how should I approach building something? Or who should I ask for this? Or what should I be working on? And you're like, but Nick, who asks you those questions? The answer is myself. I ask myself those questions a lot. Why am I doing this? What am I doing? Where do I go? And it sounds like I'm kind of just being over dramatic and I'm lost all the time. And that's partially true. I'm not usually too lost, but that's mostly an illusion. I'm actually quite lost a lot of the time. And that's okay. That's a lot of the product management role. So to illustrate my point, I have a small anecdotal story about the ambiguity of the role. My first day on the job, it was so exciting. I was like, wow, Google, this is such a cool place to be. This is back when we could see human beings in person and we weren't on a computer screen all the time. And so I walked into my office and I was like, wow, it's an office. And then my manager was like, hey, nice to meet you. Here's your desk. Incredible. I was like, this is the corporate life. I get a desk, I have a manager, I'm an employee, this is great. And then he's like, yeah, you have a meeting in 30 minutes or so. I just wanted to make sure you were prepared. I was like, I got this. I can take notes. I'm gonna be a good listener in this meeting. Nailed it. Turns out he was like, no, that's not how this is gonna work. You're running this meeting. It's your meeting in 30 minutes. And I was like, I'm new here, right? And he's like, yeah, but it's your meeting. It's where you're going to meet your engineers. You're going to talk about your project, and we need you to kind of lay out the roadmap for the summer. And I was like, that's going to be really confusing for everyone involved, especially me. And then we talked for a little bit, and he was like, yeah, it'll be great. You should just put together a couple of PowerPoint, or slides, put together a deck, and you'll go through it for 30 minutes. It'll be really easy. The key question you might be asking is but Nick, what were you working on? Trust me, that was my question too. I had no clue what my project was up until this point. I just knew I was working in Chrome OS. And Chrome OS, for those who aren't aware, is the operating system. It's kind of like a browser, but in an operating system form that runs on Chromebooks. That was not my project. My project was styluses. I was building hardware. And I was taught that about 15 minutes before my meeting started. And then my manager was like, great, you have 10 minutes, just throw together some slides, it'll be good. And it ended up being great. Engineers were really nice, everyone was really friendly, but I was super scared that I was going to completely screw it up. A lot of product management is encapsulated in that story. You are given ridiculously high expectations, way too much responsibility, and very little instruction on what you're actually supposed to do. And the reason that they do that is partially because you're kind of a manager and you're going to have to make decisions and you're supposed to be good at that. The other reason is that it's up to you. They don't want to tell you what you're supposed to do because your job is to kind of go and figure stuff out. So that's a long story and a lot about ambiguity that didn't really tell you anything about like how to address ambiguity, but that comes later. This is the fun part where you're like just as confused as I am. So after ambiguity, this leads relatively nicely into like, okay, so I have to do stuff given very little direction. What is the stuff? Great question. Stuff is meetings, docs, and decks, and that's a lot of your role actually as a PM, is you spend pretty much half of your life or more in meetings, and when you're not in meetings, you're writing docs and decks for those meetings. It's really fun. So with all of those things, meetings, docs, and decks, less is more. And the reason I say that is kind of manyfold. First reason is people up until this point in your life have been paid to read what you wrote, like your professors and teachers and things. Now that's not true. These people you work with, they do not have to read what you wrote. In fact, most of them will not. If it's too long or too much, they'll just skip it. And that's great and all until someone starts asking you the same set of questions about like why your product is built this way or why, styluses haven't shipped yet, but you wrote it in a doc, they never read it. So the thing with less is more is no one wants to spend their time like wasting away in meetings, except for you, because you're a product manager and that's actually your job. But everyone else does not really want to be in a meeting. So meetings, short as possible. You want to not waste people's time, only include people if they actually have to be there. The like docs and decks part, short, few things per slide. And even with like the few things per slide, don't keep people on slides for too long. On docs, don't make the docs like 20 pages. No one's gonna read that. People barely read like the 4-page docs I put in front of them. You put like a 1-pager in front of people and they're like, I might have time between my coffee breaks. Like, it's just not gonna get read. And it sounds kind of dramatic and you're like, no, I'm sure people read it. And yeah, like I have a really nice engineer who will read a lot of my docs because he's way too nice to me. But generally, people are trying to get stuff done. So, don't waste people's time. The other piece is the product life cycle. It sounds like I'm going really fast through all of this. I promise I'll slow down because you'll actually have questions about things and I'll answer them. But the product life cycle is what I kind of do on my day-to-day with all of these meetings, docs, decks, and ambiguity. And it looks, well, if you put it really, really nicely, it looks like this, a beautiful circle with, 4 beautiful arrows and good coloring. It's not actually how it works in real life, but that's kind of the idea, is you start off the product life cycle. Maybe you're doing some like Q1 or Q4 or yearly planning, and there's a bunch of really important people, and then there's you in a meeting, and you're all talking about like the cool ideas for things you want to build. So right now I work on Google Fi, and so we're building phone plans. So in our ideation and planning cycle, that happens right around now. And we're often thinking about like, what are our users saying? What are people talking about? What's our vision for the future? And it sounds really big and grandiose. And sometimes it is. And you're like, wow, this is super exciting. I'm like planning the future. It's awesome. Sometimes it's really not all that grandiose and you're not in one of those cool big meetings. In fact, you're just sitting there at your laptop going, wouldn't it be cool if like our watches had cell plans? Like, maybe that's something you're thinking about and you're really excited about it. Maybe you're like myself and you're like, styluses are cool. What if we had like 10 different styluses? That'd be fun. And then you write what's called like a 1-pager, or you go around and bug everyone nearby and you ask them, what do you think about this idea? And sometimes they're like, that's an awesome idea. Sometimes they tell you, that's a terrible idea. And for this, I have a different story. So in the ideation phase of stuff, you might be thinking, why would you ever let a like entry-level employee come up with new ideas for the vision? Shouldn't they just execute on stuff? And you'd be totally right. We have no business coming up with new ideas, but we do anyway. So last summer, I was coming up with new ideas. I thought I was awesome and like thinking up great things. And I put together these like 3 different 1-pagers for different stylus designs that I thought were awesome. I went to my engineer and I was like, look at these beautiful things I've designed. Wouldn't it be great to work on them? And he looked me dead in the eyes and then laughed at me. We were very cool with each other. It was a close relationship, but he was like, no, we're not going to build any of those things because that's a terrible idea. And I was like, what? He was much nicer about it, by the way. I'm being dramatic. He was like, well, let's talk about this and maybe think about some new ways we could approach this. And what he meant by that is let's throw all of that away and try and think about this from the actually important perspective, which is the user's perspective, the people who are actually going to use your products. I'm going to hammer this home a few more times, but remember, your products are not useful without anyone using them. No one cares to build products in a vacuum. So just remember that, keep it in the back of your mind. I'll bring it up a few more times. So I was like, oh, okay, sure. And then we talked about users and came up with other ideas and visions for the future. And it was really productive. So you come up with all these great ideas. You have the most cool styluses ever, and your engineer and you are super excited about it. Then you go into like actually designing stuff. Usually there's maybe a checkpoint there. Someone in leadership says, oh, actually, let's move forward with this and not with this. So let's slot that later in the year, whatever. But you get to a point and you're designing things. And this is kind of the bulk of your work as a PM, at least in certain types of PMing. For myself, this has been true, especially when you're working on hardware, is you're saying, okay, now we have to design a bunch of stuff. Because in like hardware, for example, your launch process, this whole circle takes years. Like you're like, oh, cool, we designed something. And now we're going to go spend millions of dollars and lots of time and energy on building it. And if it breaks, that's on you. So you spend a lot of time designing stuff. You build this thing called a PRD, and PRD stands for Product Requirements Document. It's really fun. And some people like to write really long ones. That was me. My first PRD was 20 pages, and it was terrible. No one read it. Remember, less is more. So now I write PRDs at max, they're 5 pages, preferably less. And you spend a kind of an inordinate amount of time on them because you write your first draft of a PRD and you're like, this is what the product should look like. This is the grand scheme. Here's all the constraints. And then your engineers are like, no, that's not possible. And they come back to you and you rehash some stuff. And then you put it in front of UX and UX is like, oh, that's not going to make any sense. That's a terrible user experience. Or sometimes they're really good. Like I'm being dramatic. I'm not this bad at my job, but you go back and forth a lot on PRDs and design docs. And maybe you start to get an engineering design doc put forward. Maybe you start to get some like mocks put up and you kind of get a sense of what the product will actually look like. And then you get to go and actually build it. Again, there's usually a gatekeeper here, like my boss, who will say, oh, this looks good. You're ready to move forward. Let's start building it. And this is all from the perspective of a big tech company. Startups are a little different. So you're building this cool product and you have some people working on it and your UX and your eng are collaborating and everything is beautiful and golden. That's of course not how the real world works. Sometimes things break, things get sidetracked, staffing and resources kind of go all over the place sometimes. We'll talk about that in the skills section, but ideally things get built and you're like, yay, things have been built, this is awesome. And then when everything's good to go, all the I's have been dotted, T's have been crossed, then you launch stuff. I added the plus land in there. People often forget about that. But the launch is the big deal. You're like, wow, my product's going to be seen by at least one person who's not my grandmother. And you're really, really excited about that. And so it's a really exciting day. Usually things aren't going too hairy. Like I think in movies, it's like a lot of people yelling. Everyone's running all over the place. I've been in many launch events at this point, and there usually is very minimal yelling. It's like people are just pretty chill. You kind of go and check some stuff, make sure everything kind of makes sense, then you put it out into the public. Launches are really cool because then you get the people who matter using your actual product. And that's really exciting. It feels cool. It's why you do what you do as a product manager. And then the landing part, that's just the afterwards. So it's launched, it's out there, people are using it. Now you have to go and check that you actually did what you said you were going to do. Did all the metrics you set out in your PRD actually come true? Did you predict the future with astonishing accuracy? Did you actually do everything right? And then you do what's called a postmortem if you're good about your product management skills. And you go and check, did this whole circle actually make sense? Were there any bugs or glitches that you encountered at the beginning or the middle or at the end? Did things work? Was anyone upset throughout the process? And hopefully the answer is no, and you can go forward again. The kind of misleading part of this diagram is it implies that you're just at some point on this circle at any one time. That would be awesome. Instead, you usually have maybe 3 to 5 projects going at once, and they're all at different points in this diagram, and some of the people are shared between different parts of this diagram. So it's not as clean as it looks, but that was my best approximation to what a perfect product lifecycle might look like. That was a lot to go through, and I'm sure people are like, well, there was so many things. That's fine. I'll hopefully break down some of the more important parts of what I'm talking about in the next section. So that was a little bit, or a lot, of me talking about what product management kind of is in as best of an approximation as I could get. But here's some of the skills that make a little bit of that high-level overview a little bit more concrete. So I used my mouse to create what I think is an appropriate diagram to illustrate the 4 different areas of skills that you need. And you might be like, but Nick, people and management are very similar. And I would say, Yeah, kind of, but they're not quite the same. And then, of course, there's the technical skills, which I always start with because people are most freaked out about that usually. And then there's the product skills, like the whole product management part. That's the product part. So we'll start with the technical part, which is where people are usually like, oh my God, am I technical enough? And it's like, well, you shouldn't become a PM to not be technical, but being an expert programmer does not make you a good PM. Being technical is useful, and that's what I'm going to talk about in this section, but it's not something that you have to be like the person who's going to go and code the app or code the whatever or build stuff. Like, imagine if I go into the Android team and I say, hey guys, I'm going to code Android for the next month. They'd be like, no, please don't. Go back to what you were doing. Like, that's our job. And so you have engineers often, or you have UXers, and you have other people who they're really good at what they do. It's one of the greatest things that I love about being at a big tech company is you have some people who are just absolute tanks at what they do. Like, I have a UXer who works with me. She has more experience in UX than I have years of life. She is way better at UX than I am. And that's okay. I'm okay with that. And she would certainly not want me to go in and use my technical skills in Figma to try and design something. She would much rather that she got to do that, and then I would talk with her about it. That being said, and I very rarely code, there are times where it's really convenient to be able to. And you might be like, but you just said I don't need that many technical skills. And it's like, yeah, it's a weird balance. I've coded maybe twice in my job as a product manager. And even then, it's kind of like, well, was it really coding? It wasn't production code. It wasn't code that ever got seen by an actual user of Google's products. It was code to like make a task easier or automate something that we do internally, or it's things to like make my life a little bit simpler, or to take something off of an engineer's plate. For example, I have engineers sometimes who are like really overloaded with all the projects and things that they're working on. So maybe they ask me to like very briefly look over some of the commits that they send and put in the code base. I'm not officially a reviewer on any of those commits, so unless the actual reviewers have already given their sign off, I can't really do anything. But I can also like go and say, hey, like, to our TLM, would you mind like getting that done for my engineer? They're just really stressed right now. It'd be really helpful. A lot of the coding pieces that I've had to do are more like one-off things that just made everyone's lives a little bit faster and easier. So I rarely code. It's not really part of the job, and it is certainly not a requirement in terms of like you're going to be coding every day. It is a requirement in terms of needing to be aware of what you're actually talking about. So being able to code is one thing. Being able to like be technical is really kind of flimsy. So as an example, if someone asked you to go and build a website, if you're maybe not super technical, you might be like, oh, sure, I could build it in Wix or in Squarespace or in Google Sites. And that's totally fair. That's true. You could build a website in either of these tools. If you're a little bit more technical, you might say, okay, yeah, I could build a website in like, if you're old school, maybe PHP and Laravel. Or if you're a little bit more new age, you might build a progressive web app in React. Or if you're at Google, maybe Angular. And so you might be able to do those things. But what technical actually does, and if you're a little bit more technical than those, then you might say, well, it depends on what you need. If you're asking me to build a web app or a website for X reason, then I think we would need to approach it as like a full stack sort of thing. For example, something with like a Firebase backend or Firestore backend, and like an Angular front end and something in the middle to generate all of the static stuff that we're actually going to use. And that would be one approach, but there's other approaches that might be appropriate depending on your use case. And it gets nuanced and complicated. But the key thing is that you recognize that nuance and you understand that there is some complexity there. And so when people say technical, you're not going and coding day to day, but when you're in a meeting and someone is saying, hey, we want to build a stylus, we're not really sure like the best approach to that, it's good for you to be able to start presenting some options. Or alternatively, if your engineer says, we should build it this way, then it's really useful to be able to say, actually, I don't understand why that is the best option relative to this other option that I know about. If, for example, in the web stack kind of pseudo example I was giving, then it might be like my engineer says, hey, you know what? We think we should totally build this completely on AWS. And it's like, oh, okay, but I don't understand why that's different. Like, can you tell me the trade-offs between that and like GCP, for example? And you're maybe technical enough to guess at some of those trade-offs, but your engineer will fill in the gaps. They'll say, oh, well, there's this, and this reason. The technical piece of that is being aware of your skill set, your tools. And all of that really kind of ends up coming down to people anyway, because you're trying to establish mutual respect. And that is really what the technical skill set is, in my humble opinion, about, is you're establishing this respect. Like, obviously, you should respect your engineers, you should respect your designers, you should respect your data scientists, and so on. And hopefully, obviously, they should respect you back, just kind of, default baseline level of human interaction. But it's also really, really helpful for them to be able to say, oh yeah, Nick's looking out for me. Like, he understands enough, he's done his homework. He went out and he understood a little bit about, the way that networks worked for Phi. And he took the time to go and understand what the different operators are doing, why they're doing that, how some of the tech works, how some of the wavelengths interact with each other, and why we might like one over the other. It was really nice that he was able to kind of bring that knowledge to the table in X meeting. And the reason that's important is you want people to feel like you're putting effort, you're looking out for them, you're caring about them. And part of that's the technical skills. Part of that is understanding what they're going through. What's it like to go and submit a commit? What's it like to go through a code base? What is the level of effort required to build a mock on Figma versus to build some sort of high fidelity schematic to be used in a presentation? It's helpful for you to be able to understand those things so that you're not asking people to go and build an open research problem answer in 3 days. So that's kind of my spiel on technical. The next skill set that I think is really important, and I alluded to a little bit there, was people. So I think this is distinct from managerial skills in that you can be really good with people and be a terrible manager, and vice versa. I think it's a little harder to be vice versa, but still possible. So with people, you spend so much time in meetings. And meetings are not like you alone with a video camera. They're you with other people in a video camera. So it's, well, at least in the modern day. Meetings are so much of your life and time as a PM, and you might be like, but why are you in so many meetings? And the partial answer to that is I go to a lot of them so that my team doesn't have to, because yeah, I'm spending a bunch of my time in meetings, but it's so much worse if an engineer or a UXer or a data scientist or even a business biz ops person is spending all of their time in meetings. They're doing stuff. An engineer's coding things, a UXer's building designs. These people should be doing their jobs, not spending all their time in meetings. And it's kind of your job as a PM, though, to be spending your time in meetings. And you're like, but Nick, you just said that we're writing docs, we're designing stuff, we're visionaries. Yeah, that's true. But a lot of times you're getting those designs and those ideas by talking to everyone. So you understand the reason that your product is important, or the way that it all comes together, and who to even ask about stuff by meeting with everyone. So you meet with your engineers, of course, you meet with your UXers, you meet with your data scientists, you also meet with their bosses, you meet with your own boss, you meet with other PMs, you meet with everybody. And you meet with people at different levels too, because you want to understand from the different levels of the business, what are people caring about? A VP and the C-suite folks, they don't care necessarily about whether or not one tiny little word is the way that it is. Some of them do, but on the by and large, they're going to be caring much more about the vision and strategy of the company. How does Google play into the grander ecosystem of tech products? So when you're talking to them, you get a sense of kind of the high level overview. Where's the ship moving? But if you're talking to your own manager, you're talking to maybe the leads for UX or Eng, they also have some pretty high level overview stuff, but they're within your product area. They're not thinking all of Google. They're thinking, over here at Chrome OS, how do we fit in? How do we fit into the Google ecosystem? How do we fit into the broader kind of laptop ecosystem? They're really interested in that, and they know a lot about it. They've done their research about it. They can tell you things. They can answer your questions. And they can also tell you if your idea would make sense more broadly than oh, I think this is a beautiful product. That might be true in the very narrow context of what you understand. But if you're talking to someone who understands the entire industry, they can tell you a lot more about that. And I guess that was kind of a pseudo example that I was speaking to in my mind, an experience I had last summer where I was these styluses. You're like, dude, no one cares about styluses. I did. And I was sitting there trying to build all these different styluses and pens. And I had a conversation with one of our VPs, and he was like, yeah, that's great. But have you thought about the way that different human interaction devices will work in the broad long term? And I was like, nope, haven't thought about that at all. And then we had a great conversation about it. And it's not that I necessarily needed his consent to move forward with the project or anything, but it was really useful to have that perspective. So you're talking to people at all levels to try and build an understanding of what exactly is going on. Helps you deal with the ambiguity thing too. And all of that has to happen in like a productive context. People really don't like it if you schedule time on their calendars and meet with them to do nothing. That would be really annoying. So I always recommend scheduling meetings with people as like introductory meetings. Care about them, figure out the people, find out their stories. What are they interested in? But you still need your meetings to be like productive towards, you know, your job. So the example I have with this is last summer, my lead engineer, electrical engineer, another person with just more years of experience than I have been alive. Great guy, super nice, very talkative, just like myself. Problem with two talkative people in one room, one meeting, is you guys talk a lot. You guys being me and him. And I also really wanted to know about him and his life story. And he talks a lot, so then we might spend all of the meeting on him and his life story and me and my life story, and we never get to the actual product that we're trying to build. So what I ended up doing is I said, well, I know this about him, I know this about myself, so we're gonna just extend all of our meetings, all of our one-on-ones by 10 minutes. We're gonna just spend the first 10 minutes really talking about, I learned that he was taking Spanish classes, he loves to talk about his kids and his dogs. One is named Bean, I thought that was really cute. And he also liked to talk about his 3D printing, which ended up getting me into 3D printing. And it was a really cool bonding experience. But we then would spend the other 30 minutes talking about the things that the original meeting was for. And it ended up being productive. And so when you're dealing with people, when you're trying to talk and understand the broader context of what you're doing, just remember, be productive. It's difficult sometimes when you're spending all your time in meetings and you feel like you should just be writing docs. But meetings are productive too. You just have to make them that way. The last piece, not the last piece, I'm so sorry. The next piece I wanted to talk about was the product piece of product management. So it seems like it would be half of the role as a product manager, the other half being management, but it ends up being most of it. It's the entire role because it's all about products. Everything within a product that you're building, everything about the things around you, they all can matter. Not all of them do at all times, but any of them could become significant depending on how you look at it. And what I mean by that is like, you have to think about why you're building all of these products, and any detail could matter because it might affect your user. The user of your product is the only source of truth, the only person who matters. They are the people that you do this all for. Never forget as a product manager that you are doing things to help people. And the reason that I stress that and think it's so important is because it is super easy to get lost in the data or in making numbers move or in trying to, solve a hard technical problem. It's really easy to solve problems that aren't problems. For example, it's really great to go and build an incredible techie gizmo gadget, but if no one's going to use it or it's not really addressing like their immediate concerns, who cares? Like, it's a great technical feat, that's awesome, but it's not actually helping anyone. And so what I mean by like no detail is too insignificant and care about the user is look around you pretty much anywhere that you are right now and think like if the wall that was in front of you was like slanted, would that bug you? Probably, but that might have come down to some minor detail like the angle at the bottom. Like whatever there's probably no PM for that, but if there was a PM for that, then that might have been something in their PRD. Angle must be between, -1 and 2. And that sort of thing, like that level of detail seems so insignificant when you're just writing it on paper, but you have to remember like there's people who will end up actually interacting with your product. So it's important. And I promise all of these things will also come up when we talk about recruiting. It's not like I'm just telling you this and then you're like, but how do I become a PM? We'll get there. So that all being said, you still should inform your choices about products with data. What I mean by this, and this deals with the ambiguity part from the very beginning, is a lot of times you're building this cool new product and there's just no answer. Like there's no right answer. You could make any sort of decision that would be reasonable. What I mean by that though, is like there are certain decisions that are very, very reasonable. For example, the styluses that I designed last summer, one of their requirements is that chewing on them does not poison you. You might be like, that sounds like a very reasonable thing. You'd be correct. That was an easy assumption to make. Another kind of very easy, obvious assumption is that like you can't electrocute yourself by using one of my styluses. Very easy, low ball, you're like, yep, that checks out. But some other assumptions that are a little less obvious is like, how long should a stylus be? And you're like, I don't know, who cares? Yeah, but you should care because certain users will care about that. Some people have like really large hands and a tiny stylus feels awful. And some people have really tiny little hands and like too big of a stylus is really unwieldy. So it matters and you need to kind of collect some data. You might run some user studies. And essentially, if you can't tell, I'm obsessed with figuring out what users actually need and want. I generally lean towards like, go and ask people. Like, just go and put a stylus in someone's hand and ask them what they think. If you don't have that ability, maybe you're building cool new voter registration software. Well, it's really hard to go and just talk to users and be like, hey, can you just register to vote for like 400 times, and then I'm going to just check each one? That's really weird. So there's other ways, and you kind of collect data and you try to understand, like, how do these numbers tell me what I should be doing? And in the end, you'll make a decision. If that decision's wrong, you live with it, you adjust. If your decision's right, you go, yes, little win, and then you move on. And you're just trying to use data and your understanding of users to make the best choices possible. And then my last kind of point on product is it astounds me that people would ever go and build a product and then not use it. Like, what phone plan do you think I'm on? It's a rhetorical question. Of course I'm on Google Fi. I work on Google Fi. You should of course be on the products that you're using, or that you're building, sorry. The other piece of this though that's a little less obvious is, you should also certainly be using all the other products around. Anything you can get your little hands on, go and find those products and use them. See why people like them. If they're a product that's good enough for you to have heard about it, it's certainly good enough for people to have loved it. They care about it. They like that product for some reason. Go and understand that reason. Be one of the users. You're a person too, you're a user. So go and see what it's like. As a PM, that's super important. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was the management part. You get to manage people, it's awesome, except you have no power and you don't deserve any power. You're a new grad, like, it's ridiculous. So being a manager without any power, you might be like, that sounds counterintuitive. It is. When you're trying to manage people without any power, what that really means is you're trying to understand how these people work, what they like, what they dislike, what they're good at, what they're bad at, and tie all that together into a coherent, great circle of the product lifecycle. So to be a little bit more concrete about that, you are often in charge as a PM, sometimes as a program manager, sometimes the product manager sets these, in setting deadlines and goals. And you might be like, yeah, it's easy. You just figure out when things need to be done and you just say, get it done by that time. That's fair. You can do that. Some people will really dislike that. Some people will love it. And what's really important about the management aspect is you have to kind of go and understand everyone's point of view. Every single person on your team, where are they coming from? For example, right now on my team, I have people there's one person who's moving locations, so I know she's gonna be super busy and kind of stressed. It's a stressful time. I have a different person who just had a kid. He's like busy with other stuff. And he's coming from this perspective of like, I'm a new father, like, what do I do with my life? Oh my God, and it's incredible. I have a different person on my team who's doing none of those things. He's actually totally chill, he's having a great time. So he can be kind of overloaded with things. And you have to be careful about understanding, where are these people coming from? What are their perspectives going to be biased by or guided by, or what are they going to be better informed about? And you use that to start to kind of say, how should I set my deadlines and goals to be more understanding and careful about the people on my team? And the last piece of that is, of course, empowering your team. It's a great buzzword. What I mean by that is, if your team gets to a point, if someone on your team gets to a point where they're trying to accomplish the thing that you asked them to do, whether it's building out a feature or designing some prototype or whatever it is, if they find themselves getting stuck, we call it blocked, that's bad. That's your fault. That's the product manager's fault, because that's your whole job, is to make sure that your team's jobs go very smoothly. If my engineers are like, we don't have the designs to build what you're asking us to build, that's on me. I didn't time that right. If my UXers and designers are saying, we don't really know what you wanted to build here, that's clearly on me, because I didn't give them a good idea of what's actually being done. But if they're like, we don't even know if this is legal, like, we're not sure, we need to go back for review, then that's also on you. You didn't go through the right stakeholders, the people whose opinions actually matter in building out that product. You need to make sure that they're not blocked on stuff, that your people are able to get their jobs done when they want to get them done. So that's my spiel on the four key skills, but 4 skills I think are relatively important in product management. And now the recruiting part. I'm sure it's everyone's simultaneously favorite and most stressful part. Recruiting is super, super stressful. And I'll take a brief break of pounding into your heads, care about the user, be a product manager, and give you a funny anecdote. So, here's a bunch of tech companies' names in cool grayish boxes. You might be like, oh, this dude's about to tell me about all the companies he got into. That is not true. These are all pretty well-known companies, I think. I got rejected at least 1 time from each of them, 3 times for Facebook, twice for Microsoft, once for Uber. But Dropbox, I got rejected twice from. And the reason that I put that one at the end is because Dropbox took about 1.5 years to reject me from each time. So I just got rejected from Dropbox approximately 2 months ago. It was really fun. So my spiel on recruiting is recruiting for PM or SWE or just in general, and with COVID going on, it's really rough. It was never great to begin with. Like, I'm not telling you like, I had such an awesome time and it was angels and butterflies. It was pretty terrible when I was there too, but it's not like any better either. So recruiting is kind of brutal and it's really stressful and it can leave you feeling really sad about yourself. And you can be like, oh man, like it's easy for me to talk about this now. And I'm sure some of you are kind of like, yeah, dude, but you have a job. That's fair. That's a fair criticism. I remember very clearly crying after my first Facebook interview. That's rejection number 1 up there. I've had a rough time with some of these things. It hurts, especially if you get I got so close with Microsoft twice and was like, I'm going to get a job. I didn't. I got rejected both times. And it's brutal and it hurts and it's your self-esteem and it's yourself on the line and you put your best foot forward and that's rough. So this slide doesn't really have any advice. I don't have a holy grail of and here's how you solve it. I'm just here to commiserate in some ways. Recruiting can be really brutal. So, be nice to yourself. Be kind to your friends, but definitely be nice to yourself. Recruiting's hard. So that all being said, here's kind of my tips and things about recruiting, because it is brutal, but there's some ways to kind of, I don't know, clue you in a little bit to what's going on. So there's a lot of standard phases for recruiting. This is my take, and it's primarily about product recruiting. I think it generalizes reasonably well, but take it for what it is. It's just a timeline that gives you a rough estimate. So first, make sure your resume is in good order. I was going to say go and have it reviewed by people. That doesn't really make any sense. I had my resume reviewed by 50 people. And all of a sudden, it was just awful. I took my resume to my partner, who's awesome, and she looked at it. And I'm mostly quoting her here. She goes, "This is the worst resume I've ever seen in my life." And I was like, that's fair. And I'd gotten it reviewed by all these people and I was kind of hurt. But her point on that was that your resume is the beautiful packaging of all of the hard work and all of the great things you've done. And you're like, but I'm not technical enough. I haven't done anything. I've had no impact. That's not the important part. The important part is that you care about how to quantify things, that you care about showing off your impact, especially with product management resumes. That's often what's being looked for is does this person care about the problems that they were trying to solve? Or let me rephrase that. Does this person understand problems around them? Do they try and do things to fix them? If that problem is something really minor and it's only you're writing a dashboard to be used by the 3 people on your team, that's great. You saw a problem, people didn't have access to information, you tried to fix it, you built a dashboard, and it was used by people. You helped people, 3 people on your team. If you can put that into a resume, that's awesome. Do that. It's for product management and things like that, resume stuff is important. People care. It's your first pass. But also, that being said, don't forget to apply. Sometimes I feel like people wait so long building these really awesome resumes, and then it's December and they've never applied to anything. Put yourself out there. If you edit your resume and you feel like you made an enormous change that's going to make a huge difference, then email the recruiter and send them an updated version. But honestly, you're just trying to apply to as many things as possible. Remember, I got rejected from so many things. That was a small sampling of some of the companies I've been rejected from. There's so many out there who all said no. And it was rough. Apply to a lot of stuff. It matters. And as a freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, everyone, who knows what we want? We're all humans. We're really weird and complicated. Apply to a lot of stuff. Even things you're I don't know if I would really love that. You don't really know. Go and see. Applications are important. Sometimes the timelines are really weird. Sometimes the windows are really small. Make sure you apply to stuff. Stay on top of your deadlines. Make a spreadsheet or something. Find a buddy. The next piece, after you've applied to stuff, things went well. People saw your resume and they're like, holy something. And we're going to take this person to a phone screen. Phone screens aren't always there. And if you're coming from SWE or other things, then usually this is actually more like a hacker rank, code live with people. It's really fun. Phone screens are more common in product because they want to test your kind of communication skills and your product sense. So things to focus on when you're thinking about, oh shoot, I have this phone screen coming up. What am I going to do? Walk yourself through with some other people. How would you answer, how to design Google Drive for preschoolers? Or how would you, I'm of course thinking about Google products, how would I design Facebook Marketplace, but for businesses or enterprise? It's often a very open-ended, ambiguous question. And the goal is to see what you do with that ambiguity. Do you break down the problem into a manageable chunk using logic and reasoning? Are you very clear about your logic and reasoning and you state things very precisely and very cleanly to your interviewer? Or are you like, oh my God, this is very confusing, let's just pick, and then you go and hope it works. Hopefully it's relatively obvious that the first choice of being kind of clear and logical and concise with your interviewer, it's usually what's being looked for. Then there's often a written assignment with product management, and people are like, homework. Yeah, that's fair, it is homework. So yeah, the goal of the written assignment is to test communication skills, almost completely cleanly. Like, yeah, your product skills are pretty important in this, but it's also about, can you write, remember, less is more, can you write your ideas down into a format that helps amplify your point such that you have such a strong point that you don't even have to be there to walk someone through it? And if your answer to that is yes, I do have such a strong point that I don't have to be there to walk someone through it, nice, you nailed it. Then there's interviews. And this is the piece that people are often very concerned about. And they're like, oh my God, interviews. And that's totally fair. Sometimes you have a bad day. It happens. Interviews are really difficult for a number of reasons. I think those reasons are often different from what people think. The content of the interview, yeah, that's important. You need to be able to break down products, having some frameworks, go and read Cracking the Coding Interview or Decode and Conquer, find the ways that people kind of canonically answer questions, do your homework. But the other thing with interviews is it's so awkward and weird to try and express what you're thinking about this really vague problem that you're never going to actually build, to an interviewer who you just met, who you're going to pretend is your collaborator, but they're actually testing you. It's a bizarre setup. With interviews, go and find your friends. Ask the friends that have certain skills, very precise questions about how to address or assess your interviewing skills. And what I mean by that was a lot of vagueness, is I have a friend who's an expert in algorithms. And what that might mean is that I go to him and I say, hello, algorithms genius, please sit down with me and practice my technical interviews. I want you to ask me about these algorithms, and I want you to tell me about how I break down the problem and how I should get unstuck. That's quite literally what I did, and it was super helpful. I have other friends who are really good at their product sense. They just have great senses of how products should be built. Maybe they're PMs themselves. I have different friends who are really solid at business and strategy. How do different businesses' interests play into a grander market? And those are really helpful for strategy questions about hey, you're the PM for Uber. How would you deal with taxis? There's so many of these different styles of question and different skills that you might want to grab from people around you. Ask them about those skills. It's important, because then you're going to avoid a lot of the conflicting advice from interviews. If you ask people for interview prep, a lot of times if you ask two people, they give you different advice. That's no good. It allows you to be a lot more focused, have really good questions for the people who practice your interviews with you, and certainly make sure to practice interviews with other people. It's very different. It's one thing to practice questions in your head. It's another to practice it with other people. So that's a lot of talking in a row. I do have a thing that I can walk through, the link at the top, the pminterview.com. It's not from me, I'm not advertising it, I'm not in any way affiliated with it except by being a product manager, but it's a pretty decent website for generating questions that you might see in a product manager's interview. And they often have, they break it down into the different types of questions that can be asked. I often used that to practice interviews with my friends. That way my friends didn't have to come up with their own original product questions. I do have a kind of question structure there. I was going to crowdsource answers to X and Y. I also know that I only have 12 minutes left, and I'm positive people have some questions. So I'm happy to go through kind of a general framework that I use for questions and kind of talk through why I think each step is important. But I'm also happy to just open it to general Q&A depending on what people want. So at this point, it's kind of up to you guys. I can walk through a product question here where you guys fill in X and Y, and then I'll kind of go through it with you. Or we can walk through a technical question at the level of roughly what a PM might kind of see. Or we can go through general Q&A. Completely up to you. Put your answers in the chat. Pick option 1, 2, or 3. And that way it'll give us a pretty good sense. I think Zoom has polling, but yeah, I'm not a technology expert, obviously. Cool. So out of a sample size of 5, 3 of those were 1. Thank you for your participation, you blessed 5. So we're going to go through kind of my approach to interview questions. I'll try and keep it brief to allow some time for Q&A. Would anyone like to venture like an X equals Y equals for me? Preferably X is not Google, just because I feel like it's weird to talk about Google so much. Also, feel free to drop it in the chat, shriek at the top of your lungs into the microphone. Don't do that. That's actually, it would make people very upset. I'll just kind of, I'll give you like 10 seconds. And if no one drops anything into the chat, then I'll just, oh, nice. Okay, we have X, Facebook. Thanks, Angela. I love the comedy of the suggestions. Maybe not intentionally comedic, but X is good. Oh, you know what? Let's do, oh, I was going to say Facebook VR, but that's confusing. You know what? Let's do Neopets in VR. Sorry. I like Y as VR, and then I really like Neopets. I think that's just comically awesome. All right, so we're going to spend like 4 minutes talking about Neopets. So I'm a PM at Neopets, wild, and you need to I need to design my next big feature for VR, and I think this is kind of fun. So whenever you're given one of these questions, it's a statement. I don't know why we call them questions, but given one of these questions, the first thing that you're going to want to do is ask clarifying questions. So you might say, okay, so I'm a PM at Neopets, and I want to design a feature for VR-like things. Should I be concerned at all with kind of like budget or timeline constraints? Like, when is this feature kind of slotted for? You say it's a big feature, so my guess is that it's roughly like 1 to 2 years. Maybe I don't have to worry about budget. Your interviewer might say, yeah, that's totally reasonable. 1 to 2 years, you don't have to worry about budget. And then you might start digging into like more realistic kind of questions of like, oh, I actually need to kind of come up with some constraints, because VR and Neopets is fine, but I need to break it into like, what is an actual problem I want to solve? I might say, well, it seems to me like Neopets' like target audiences are, originally was probably young people, but nowadays is probably people who grew up with Neopets. So they're actually much more inclined to maybe be able to purchase VR headsets and things, like kind of the paraphernalia of VR. So I'm going to keep that in my kind of back of my mind. But my question here is it reasonable to assume that Neopets' audience is actually aged up a little bit? They're actually the people who grew up with Neopets, and we're not really dealing with like small children as much anymore. And what you're doing when you ask these questions as a meta point is you're trying to illustrate the information that you know. So I know Neopets is kind of a dated product, but there's still a lot of people who use it. And then you're also trying to ask a question that helps scope things down while never sounding confused. If you do accidentally sound confused or lost, that's okay. But the goal is to try and not to sound confused. So you might say, yeah, I think the audience has grown up a little bit. I think it's reasonable to assume that the age groups are a little older. Does that make sense to you? And you're saying that to your interviewer, and they go, yeah, that's totally fair. And they might disagree, right? They might say, actually, it's not quite reasonable. Let's go with the other thing that you talked about. But the really nice part about that, like, kind of question structure of like, here's what I know, here's my question, kind of, like, is that reasonable, the actual question, is it kind of constrains the problem no matter what, and your interviewer can then kind of give you hints. It also buys you a little bit of time, and it demonstrates that you know stuff. So kind of an all-around first step, ask those kinds of questions. I spend usually around 3 minutes doing that. So then after that, I have my scope of my problem. We've got some like older age group. We're dealing with Neopets, and I haven't really touched the VR aspect of this that much, but we'll get to that. My next question, anyone have a, I was gonna say anyone have a guess, we don't have time for that. If you were guessing in your head and you said users, who are your users? Great question. And you're like, but you just said older people, isn't that enough? No, you need to understand who these people might be, and you kind of break it down into different subgroups. So I say, okay, we're thinking about people in the ages of maybe, let's say 20 to 50. I give myself 30 years of age. And I'm assuming that because of the previous assumption we just made, and then you go and dive into who your users might actually be. Maybe you separate into 3 different groups. I like rules of 3. So you might say, okay, well, there's the users who are a lot younger and more inclined to maybe be technologically savvy, let's say 20 to 30. The people from 30 to 40 and the people from 40 to 50, that's not really, they're not necessarily all that different, except for the fact that the people from 30 to 40 probably might have just had kids. So let's say that there's our newer, kind of younger users who still grew up with Neopets, but they're pretty technologically savvy. Then there's our users who are a little bit older, but they just had kids who might be interested in Neopets, or they might use it as some bonding activity or something. There seems to be some use case there. And there's people who are a little older, they're just kind of like diehard Neopets fans. Maybe our smallest group, but they're really important. And so now you've broken down your users, and now you might ask, okay, what's next? And the next part is the problem. What actual problems do your users have? So what problems are you eventually going to address with your product proposal? So step 3 for me is always, what are the pain points of my users? And I am running short on time, so I will not dive into that. But you might say, oh, young people really wish that they could connect with Neopets in a way that was like cool, and they could use all of their like nostalgia. They're trying to relive some sort of experience from their childhood, and they care a lot about these experiences. We want to bring that experience into VR. It's modern age. And then you say, okay, how do I address the problems? And this is where you propose your kind of product and features or solution. That's step 4. And you say, okay, thinking about my users, thinking about their pain points, here's the best possible feature set to actually address those things. And you go through all the problems you mentioned, preferably 3, and then you come up with 3 solutions, and you say, and this all ties into, we don't need to publish our own VR headset, we're gonna do a VR app. That is the best way for us to push this to as many people as possible and spend as few resources as possible, because what we want to do is reinvigorate the experience for our primary user group, which is ages 20 to 30, and we're solving that like want and craving for a nostalgic experience. And we're adding that into the modern day and age, so we're going to put it into an app format which can be easily transferred to any VR headset. That way we're not going to have to worry about like putting in a ton of time and research effort into building our own. And so that's your like product solution, and you say that's what I should do. And then the last part that people always forget about is kind of like the sanity check and metrics. How are you going to measure how much your users liked your product? So some easier ones are like how many people download the app, how many people use it per day. Those are like a little bit more standard, but you might also say how many friends are made within the Neopets community based on our VR app. I might also measure how many like cross-platform friends are being like communicated with and mentioned. And those metrics you should then explain to your interviewer. So as a very quick, we accelerated a little bit towards the end there, but the first thing is you ask clarifying questions, try and reveal a little bit about what you know. The second piece, after you're done with that, is you establish who your users are and the people that you're actually going to try and address. And the third part is what questions what problems are people going to have? How can I start to like think about the solutions I'm going to make? And then that fourth piece is actually coming up with a solution. Make sure you have an actual product proposal. You're saying we're going to build this or this feature. And that fifth part is really important, but it's always so rough because it's at the end and you're rushing, you're out of time. That fifth piece is saying, okay, here's how I'm going to measure what I'm doing. Here's the actual metrics for success for that product cool gizmo that I just proposed. These things, if they go up, it means this. If they go down, they mean this. And you explain that to your interviewer. The whole time you're trying to be clear, trying to be concise. You're trying to make sure that your interviewer is feeling included, but not like you're lost or confused. And then the last piece is like a general piece of advice for these is take notes. I didn't take notes here because I was speaking and I'm lazy, but whenever I was in an interview, take notes. Put them down on paper. It makes you way faster and it'll make you a lot more coherent. Like you'll actually just make more sense as you go because you can look down and literally see what you just wrote or talked about. Yeah, so that was a lightning speed version of walking through that interview question. I think K-sum is an interesting interview question in that it's approximately the appropriate level of like technical level for the tech companies that have technical interview components for product management. So if you're ever confused or worried, like, am I technical enough? At a practical level of like, will you pass the technical screen for like, Google or Uber or Lyft? I would go on like HackerRank or LeetCode first, kind of like the easy intermediate level of question, or kind of anything you saw in like an intro CS class at your school. And if you're like, but I don't have enough technical skills, go and build something, or go and practice. There's ways to kind of get around that, but just, I would have walked through that if I had had time somehow magically in a different universe. I don't think I really have time for Q&A because I'd like to end on time. I will plug the talk after this one is by Mona Park. She was nice enough to show up to this chat. She's a friend of mine and an excellent designer. If you're at all interested in design, or if you were interested in PM and you realize design is actually kind of a pretty big part of that, definitely show up to her talk. It's really nice, and Mona's hilarious. Or if you're interested in Neopets, via the chat. Yeah, thank you all so much for being a very delightfully screened audience. And thank you so much for spending some of your Saturday sitting here listening to me chat. It's been really great, and I hope this was helpful.
Thank you so much, Nick.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for hosting, Ashley. All right. Bye, everyone.